Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is May 25th, 2015, and we've got a lot of topics to cover on the domestic and the international front. We're going to try to get to them all if possible. The show is being recorded on May 24th, I should mention, because we pre-record the show, but we've got a lot of things to discuss, as I said. But before we do, I want to remind everyone that you can catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That is the broadcast of the new show. The rebroadcast will take place, I believe, at 1 a.m., pretty much every night, and then at 5 p.m. on Saturday nights there at ucy.tv. And it's also being rebroadcast on Reality Bites Radio as well. So the show has grown significantly. Listenership has grown significantly. I'm getting information and contacts telling me that. So thank you all for listening. Thank you all for promoting the show. It is very much appreciated, and it is helping spread the word. It's helping expand the show. So please keep on doing that. Please keep up with your support of the show. We appreciate it very much. Now, if you're interested in my articles, then I'd remind you that I write regularly for activistpost.com. I also write the occasional article for naturalblaze.com. And you can find my articles, all of my articles, if you're interested in my work specifically, you can find my articles at brandonturbeville.com. That is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the interviews, the archives of this show. All that stuff is there at brandonturbeville.com. And the relevant information is there as well. The books tab, the events tab, if you want to see if I have any speaking events coming up, that's where you go. If you want to see if I have, if you want to purchase my books, then go to brandonturbeville.com, click on the books tab, and there they go. You can just click on them, buy them from the bookstore. So, with that being said, I want to, I guess we should talk about the march against Monsanto that happened all across the country, all across the world, really. It happened yesterday. The South Carolina march against Monsanto, there were 2 or 3. I think there was Columbia, Greenville, and Charleston. And we actually made it to the Columbia one. And it was a pretty good turnout. There were over 50 people there. For South Carolina, that's pretty good. For Columbia, especially, that's a pretty good turnout. I don't know what the numbers were for all the other cities in the state or in the country or in the other parts of the world, but it was apparently a successful rally, and it was also apparently, despite the attempts of Monsanto to try to resist this march and this backlash that the company has as well. So I want to get into what they were trying to do in a minute. But again, what I was saying, Columbia, there were about over 50 people that showed up. Lots of great signs, lots of great flyers. People were driving down the road honking, waving. Occasionally you'll get some negative response. You'll get an individual that walks by and says, "Hey, I believe in science. I believe in science." It makes you wonder if these people meet on Sundays like all the other religions. But these, it was a pretty good turnout for March Against Monsanto. Hopefully we'll get some pictures up, put those up on brandonturbeville.com, and send them out to the rest of the media. This, of course, is what we need to be doing. Demonstrating is a major part of that. Outreach is a major part of that. But I've said this so many times on other occasions that I want to repeat this one more time. What we see at these demonstrations, because we know that the government doesn't really pay attention to just demonstrating, just going out on the lawn and making speeches. They don't really pay attention to that. And the average person is maybe not going to pay attention to that as much. But what you can do, this is a way to network. There's other ways to fight the system. We'll talk about that. Demonstrating is a part of it, of course. I'm not trying to minimize that. In fact, it's an important part, is going out there and making a spectacle, going out and holding up signs and calling out the the target of your demonstration publicly and raising awareness, forcing other people to have to look at you. Of course, it is an effective way to become an activist. But one of the things that for people who are going to demonstrations, what I want you to always remember is that a very small minority of the population is aware of the issue that you're going to be demonstrating against. A very small minority of that population is going to care, and out of that small minority, only a small minority of them are actually going to go out to a demonstration and do anything. So you, if you're going to a demonstration, are part of a very small minority, which is part of a small minority, which is part of yet another small minority. Very small group of people. And you go to this demonstration, and obviously the people who are at that demonstration are of like minds. These are your people. These are people who are so interested in this issue that they're willing to give up their time and their energy and their money, and depending on the police, their safety, or depending on the general public's mindset, their safety. And so they're willing to go out and do this. And so are you. The problem is, at these things, what you generally see is that people go out, they demonstrate, they listen to a few speeches, they play on their iPhones, and then they go home. And then they go on Facebook and complain about how they don't have any friends in real life who are interested in the same issues that they're interested in. Well, part of the reason is because you don't connect with anybody outside of the internet. And the other part of the reason is that because you just went to a demonstration and nobody said anything to anybody else. Nobody introduced themselves. Nobody exchanged contact information. You probably live in the same city. You guys could probably get together. You could work on other projects. You could double your efforts. This March Against Monsanto, we had Kimberly Roberts on, I think, last week, and she was the organizer, just one person. She brought 50 people out there. But if she had 10 people working together to help make this thing a success next year, you could triple the amount of people that show up, the amount of people that participate. Even if you don't want to get together and put your heads together and try to produce something, then at least you'll have a new friend that understands the issues that you understand, and you guys can, provide yourselves a little bit of sanity, a little bit of relief from having to deal with the day-to-day zombie apocalypse that you're surrounded by. And it doesn't take too much, right? You just introduce yourself to somebody, and if somebody's hesitant to talk to you because they're part of our culture that acts like someone's weird for wanting to have a connection with another person, then move on to somebody else. There's somebody there who's interested in talking and connecting, and these things should involve speeches, they should involve yelling, they should involve signs, they should involve marching, they should involve outreach. All of those things they should involve, but they should also involve everybody at that march sharing contact information with each other. The phone numbers and email addresses and Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts, all that stuff should be exchanged at these marches between all of the people, or virtually all of the people who are involved in them. And that's how you build up a network. And that's how you build up a community where you're able to not only put your heads together, but protect one another and work together to promote your ideology in the best way possible. So go forth with that. Now, there's an article up at naturalblaze.com called The March Against Monsanto. And that was published on May 22nd. And just to give you an idea here, Monsanto is now trying to fight back against the March Against Monsanto. And it is trying to have a counter-protest. And here it says Monsanto was, recently promoting this thing, and we're trying to find it for you here. There's a Facebook page, and it's linked in the article. It's called March Against Myths About Modification. And it says that's the organization that you could link to their Facebook. What they wanted a march against the March Against Monsanto. Essentially what they wanted was to go out and confront and counter-protest the March Against Monsanto. And of course, if you go to this Facebook, what you're going to find is a bunch of hipsters, a bunch of religious scientists, the kind that are usually found in, I don't know, biology departments or something at universities that are absolutely fanatical about what they call science. It's the I believe in science crowd. It's the, this sort of worship of an academic field of study as if it's a religion, and that's what it is for these people. There's another guy who's involved with this, John Entine, who's the executive director for the Genetic Literacy Project. He is a hack from Monsanto. He's a propagandist for Monsanto. He's been promoting this counter march as well. Entine takes money from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a couple of other major organizations as well. I won't go into him too much, but just to give you an idea of what they're planning. I don't know if there's been any reports of counter-protests. It was a fairly small Facebook page, to be honest. So I don't know if there were any reports of counter-protests against the March Against Monsanto on this Saturday. What I will say is that, there have been individuals that would come up and question the issues, but, you don't know if these are people who are trying to counter the propaganda against poor Monsanto, or if it were people that were legitimately questioning what was going on. So there we have it. Now, speaking of the natural health issues, we have Senator Jeff Tart in North Carolina. Now, this was the senator who helped introduce and sponsor a bill in North Carolina that would have removed the religious exemption clause in the recommended vaccine schedule for children who were entering North Carolina public schools. This was North Carolina Bill SB 346. And I should mention that this bill has already failed, so there's no need to get up in arms about it right now, although there are rumors, and there's obviously a possibility that this bill is going to be slipped into another bill as an amendment, a more popular bill that would, some type of stupid military promotion bill or law enforcement promotion bill that people in Congress can scarcely find themselves to vote against, regardless of how bad the amendments are. But it's likely that this will get put back into the bills. But this is Jeff Tart. Now, he was confronted. He was in his office. He was talking about the bill, and he was confronted by Nicole Revels. Nicole is an activist in North Carolina. She's opposed the vaccine bills. The police state vaccine bills is going to remove parents' rights. She's a very good activist, and maybe we'll have her come in and talk to us on the show at some point. But she and Patty Curran went to Raleigh to hand out petitions. They had over 3,000 signatures of North Carolina residents who didn't want their rights removed, and they were handing them out to congressmen and congresswomen who were either supporting the bill or who were co-sponsors of the bill. And I've linked a video in the article, and you can see them giving a copy of the petition to Senator Tamara Behringer. And she took the petitions, and she was very pleasant. She was, patronizing, and she was completely phony. This woman is, she looks like a outcast from a Hollywood, plastic surgery hospital. But she kept telling them that she was listening to them. I'm listening. Yeah, sure. But she was pleasant nonetheless, and she took the signatures. So there was nothing to be said. They just handed her the petitions. They said their position. She said she was listening. They restated their position. They shook hands, and they went on their way. Then they went to Jeff Tart's office, and as soon as they walk in, Jeff Tart throws a fit, and he sees Revels and Curran, and he starts telling them to get out. He was going to call the sergeant in arms to have them removed, and he didn't want cameras involved. He didn't want any of that. He didn't want to be videotaped. When asked if there was a rule against cameras, he said no, there was no rule against cameras. There was a rule against you, meaning Revels. And he continued to throw his fit and whine and bitch about the cameras and the fact that he was being questioned by somebody who wasn't taking his order. He he was asked if they were going to remove the religious exemption from from North Carolina parents, and he just said yes. But then he found the sergeant at arms and had Revels and Curran removed. So you can see all of that in the video there at naturalblaze.com. It's up at activistpost.com and brandonturbeville.com. It's called Senator Explodes When Questioned About His Vaccine Bill. And you can see some funny edited pictures of Jeff Tart that are available there as well. It make him look like the clown that he really is. Now, BrandonTurbeville.com, we've got a number of new posts up there, not just articles. I just want to remind everyone that we helped organize and we videotaped a talk by Eileen Powell of Herbs and Things, who also will be a guest on this show at some point. She spoke at Coffee Etc. in Mullen, South Carolina. That's a little small town where I gave my talk about Syria. So they've got a lot of stuff going on over there. And she discussed the immune system. We've got part 1, part 2, and I think there's only 2 parts to it. Yeah, so that is up at the website. She discussed the immune system, chemicals and toxins that adversely affect the immune system, and a number of natural therapies and herbal or vitamin supplements that boost it, and that's up there as well. Eileen Powell speaking at Coffee Etc. in Mullen, South Carolina, the immune system. We've also got a 3-part video posted up by Eric Metz and Dylan Shelton of the Tax Wall Street Party and the United Front Against Austerity, speaking at the same place. The presentation is Bringing Jobs Back, Rebuilding the American Economy. They discussed the platform of the Tax Wall Street Party and a way to return jobs back to the area and to the country as a whole. They discussed the 1% Wall Street sales tax, the nationalization of the Federal Reserve, parity agriculture, tariffs, all that kind of stuff. So that's up at the website. We've got 2 interviews with Jules Before the First Cut, which are up at the website, and we've got a video of the World Crisis radio broadcast with Daniela Walls and Michael Chiotinis, where they covered my article up there as well, and of course the interview with Chuck Ocelli of the Ocelli Effect. That's all up at BrandonTurbeville.com right now. Now, I think we need to move to pressing international issues, and I think that the question of what's happening in Syria needs to be addressed. And first, what I'll do is I want to jump into this chemical weapons situation to begin with, because we've got to talk about Syria in some depth. With the Western propaganda machine working in full force, it's almost difficult to blame the average person for looking at the news and not knowing what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, it's hard to blame them, because some of this stuff can get somewhat complicated, especially when you put on this years of absolute horrific propaganda on top of it. It makes it almost impossible to understand. But we have reports about findings from the OPCW inspectors in Syria, and these are reports coming out of Reuters. Take a look at some of these headlines, right? Exclusive. Weapons inspectors find undeclared sarin and VX traces in Syria diplomats. All right? Listen to this other headline. This is coming from the Times. It says, Assad goes back on pledge to destroy nerve gas. Okay, well it sounds clear enough, right? This is what the article from Reuters says. I'm just going to read this to you, and you can hear what it says. Then we'll go through it. International inspectors have found traces of sarin and VX nerve agent at a military research site in Syria that has not been declared to the global chemical weapons watchdog, diplomatic sources said on Friday. Samples taken by experts from the Organization for the Prohibition and Chemical Weapons in December and January tested positive for chemical precursors needed to make the toxic agents. The sources told Reuters on the condition of anonymity because the information is confidential. This is a pretty strong indication that they have been lying about what they did with sarin, one diplomatic source said. They have so far been unable to give a satisfactory explanation about this finding. End quote. Now, from the title and the tone of these articles, you'd be led to believe that the OPCW inspectors had actually found sarin gas, and that they were being hidden by the Syrian government. But the article, while it presents the material in such a way to suggest that that's what happened, the truth is that the article really is engaging in clever propaganda techniques to cover over what is easily debunked in the article. The propaganda that they're putting in just enough truth so as to be a distortion more than a complete lie, but it's still a lie. So the presentation of the discovery of chemical weapons, right? This article admits that there were only traces of the chemical weapons found. So you ask, can you engage in a chemical weapons attack with trace amounts of chemical weapon precursors? All right, can you gas a city with trace amounts of chemical weapons? Now notice also that it was revealed in the article that it wasn't just trace amounts of the chemicals, of the chemical weapons. It was trace amounts of the chemical precursors needed to make the chemical agents. So trace amounts of chemicals needed to produce chemicals, needed to produce chemical weapons, are being used to goad the Western public into supporting another military adventure in the Middle East. Yet again, remember, we did this before over chemical weapons, and we claimed that there were weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, and chemical weapons. Here we again have trace amounts of chemical precursors to chemical weapons in a government research facility. Well, of course that's where they would be, right? And again, trace amounts of chemical weapons precursors. Now, if you look at the reports, the entire sources, all the sources for the report are diplomatic sources that remain anonymous. But we can assume that these diplomatic sources are Western, if not American or Israeli diplomats specifically. We can assume they're Western, but given the nature of the reports, we can assume that they're American or Israeli. So these sources suggest that because trace amounts of chemical precursors to banned chemical agents have allegedly been found, the Syrians have lied about destroying their stockpile, and they're continuing to produce and deploy chemical weapons, although they've never been shown to deploy them in the past. All right, so all this is coming on the heels of another propaganda campaign, which is attempting to blame the Assad government for using chlorine bombs against civilians in villages all across the country. And because these articles that were put out at this time were mentioning chlorine and sarin, it leads the reader to be confused between sarin gas and chlorine gas and assume that Assad is being accused and obviously guilty of using these weapons against civilians. There's not been one shred of credible evidence to suggest that the Syrian government has ever used chemical weapons against civilians or even against the terrorists, and there continues to be a lack of evidence to indict the government for that now. Now, it's noteworthy to point out that these chemical weapons attacks took place in northwestern Syria, and they took place in Idlib specifically. Both of these areas are terrorist strongholds, and the reason they're terrorist strongholds is because of their proximity to the Turkish border. And this is where the death squads are coming in, because the Turks have been inserting the terrorists across their borders, they've been rearming them, and they've been funding them. Now these reports, again, are entirely based upon activists. Remember the activists say school of journalism, that means death squads, and doctors located in the areas in question. Remember, Doctors Without Borders has been notorious for actually giving medical support to death squads. Remember, they've acted as Al Qaeda's medical services. Now, these doctors, who also remain nameless, are a relatively new propaganda citation, but again, considering the location of the doctors in that northwestern Syria area, with the track record of Doctors Without Borders, for instance, these sources can, in my opinion, just be relegated to the scrap heap unless they can produce some evidence. It would be nice if we saw some evidence, if you have all this evidence. So these, even Reuters has to admit that none of those claims were independently verified. And the activists, aka terrorists, are claiming that the Syrian army dropped chlorine weapons via helicopters on them and civilians, Well, the death squads are so worried about that, right? They dropped chlorine bombs on civilians that we've been beheading and raping on a continual basis. Well, there's been no proof offered that they've dropped, that the Syrian army has dropped chlorine weapons on the death squads. There's a number of reasons to question the motivation behind, the idea that the Syrian army would even use that type of material. Why would Assad use chemical weapons when he's defeating the terrorists already? Whenever the Syrian army is able to engage them in direct combat, the Syrian army's winning. Why, while the world watches Syria over its alleged chemical weapons stockpile, despite the fact that it was turned over to the UN and the OPCW, and while the West continues to accuse Assad of using chemical weapons at every opportunity that it finds, there's no reason why Assad would choose to use the weapons now. It would be insanity to do that. And it's also important to point out that chlorine weapons, which are what Assad is actually being accused of using, they're not generally used by state actors. This is the type of weapon that's used by guerrilla fighters, because these are industrial chemicals that can be used as chemical weapons, and that's why they're used by guerrilla fighters, because there's more accessibility to chlorine-based weapons. And this is what guerrilla fighters tend to use, not state actors. I guess the most important thing we can point out, though, is that the chemical attacks that happened recently, if they happen at all, is that the death squads in Syria have a history of using chemical weapons, not just chlorine, not just other chemical weapons, but chlorine gas specifically. Remember, in March of 2013. There was an attack in Khan al-Assal by the death squads, and they were using chlorine gas. We even had a report by Alex Thompson of the Telegraph that the likelihood of that being used by the Syrian government was extremely low, and that it was the death squad. So the reason we looked at this report, and we find that it was a homemade, locally manufactured rocket, and it had a form of chlorine that they call Cl-17, which is easily available as a swimming pool cleaner. And the warhead that was used in that attack had a quantity of the gas, and it's dissolved in saline solution. And again, it's usually used for swimming pools or industrial purposes, and is rated as level 2 under the Chemical Weapons Convention, meaning it has dual purpose. It can be used as a weapon for industrial or domestic purposes, but it can also be used, it can be used as a weapon or for industrial or domestic purposes. Level 1 agents are the chemicals that are used as weapons, and that's it. It's like sarin or tabun gas or something like that. So we know that there's been extensive experimentation by the death squads in Iraq in the use of chlorine. We know that. And the interesting thing about this, it's harmful when you mix it with water to form hydrochloric acid, right? It vaporizes quickly, meaning that if there's a big explosion, it's going to evaporate in a small blast. It'll turn into airborne droplets, but it'll disperse quickly. So it's going to produce limited casualties. And in Khan al-Assal, there were only 26 fatalities, and that's a lot fewer fatalities than would have been expected from a full chemical weapons attack. In other words, what Thompson is trying to point out, and what I'm trying to point out, is that yes, chlorine can be easily improvised into a chemical device, but not a chemical device that would be used by an army. It's used by guerrilla fighters, right? Because of its very nature. Now, remember, December 2012, the death squads managed to recapture a chlorine factory inside Syria, and the Syrian government actually issued a warning that the death squads might attempt to use chemical weapons, chlorine-based chemical weapons, and that's exactly what they did. The Syrian Foreign Ministry actually put out a statement warning people of that. We also had that chemical weapons attack in Ghouta that were initially blamed on Assad and the Syrian government, but we found out, some of us knew early on, but the mainstream media was even forced to admit later on that the terrorist attack, the chemical weapons attacks, were the work of the Western-backed terrorists. And we have information, very good information, that the victims in that attack were actually from Latakia, and they were captured civilians from Latakia, brought over to Ghouta, and then killed and used in video footage as human stage props. We've got articles up on that as well. So this is This is what we're looking at when we talk about chemical weapons. Now, we've also got to mention this Abu Sayyaf, this Abu Sayyaf killing, right? We did another phony narrative, and this is being, of course, being used to justify military action again. This is more like mission creep, I guess we should say. The fact that the United States Special Operations Forces have conducted their first publicly announced operations inside Syria, and this is getting extremely dangerous here. And this is the U.S. military, again, which is supposed to exist for the sole purpose of protecting and defending the nation from invasion. And remember, we've got Obama promising a while back that they would not be we would not be committing to boots on the ground in Syria. Well, now we've got boots on the ground in Syria. Big surprise, right? So the reports are that we have U.S. Special Operations Forces carrying out a raid in Deir el-Sur in Syria. They killed Abu Sayyaf, he's also known as Mohammed Shalabi, and they allegedly captured Sayyaf's wife. The U.S. has described Sayyaf as the equivalent of ISIS's chief financial officer, and that he was responsible for directing the financial operations of ISIS that were related to oil and gas. So we've got reports from all over the mainstream media, USA Today, of course, talking about a major deep raid inside eastern Syria. They killed a senior Islamic leader who oversees illicit oil production and capturing his wife, Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter said Saturday. So we've got all these reports. We won't go through the reading of the reports. It's all mainly a press release. Anyway, they allegedly took Sayyaf's wife to Iraq for interrogation. They announced, I should point this out, it was previously announced by the Syrian government that the SAA, the Syrian army, had killed an ISIS oil minister along with 40 ISIS fighters in an operation in Deir el-Sur. So in other words, we have this operation in Deir el-Sur. The Syrian government comes out and says, we just killed an ISIS oil minister and 40 ISIS fighters in this operation, and shortly thereafter, the United States comes out and says, yeah, we have special operations forces inside Deir el-Sur, and we killed Abu Sayyaf. Yeah, to much applause, all right? The only difference here is that the oil official that was reported as being killed by the Syrian army was Abu al-Taim al-Saudi, right? This is, the report stated that he had been killed in the Omar oil field, which is Deir el-Sur's largest oil field. So what do you make of this? I mean, what do you make of the fact that the Syrian army announces a dead terrorist, and then hours later the United States claims that they killed him? Is the United States trying to claim that, victory, seal the glory from the Syrian army over this victory? Are they trying to, or were they really involved in some type of operation where they were trying to get boots on the ground inside Syria? Or what's going on? Well, let's look at the fact that the U.S. and a number of other Western countries are already engaged in a bombing campaign inside Syria, right? That's evidence enough that the U.S. military is directly involved in combat operations there. The U.S. and NATO, along with the GCC and Israel, have funded and facilitated and trained and armed terrorists running rampant across Syria, and that's well known. But this recent announcement that U.S. Special Forces have conducted a raid in Deir el-Sur, this marks the first public announcement that U.S. military personnel are physically on the ground inside the country. Now, again, this is despite promises from Obama that this wouldn't happen. We all knew that wasn't true. But let's be honest, this is not the first time that Western personnel have been found on the ground inside Syria. I mean, early on in the conflict, 13 French military officers were captured by the Syrian government and were returned to the French government as soon thereafter. The CIA has long been involved inside Syria ever since the beginning of the conflict until the present day. There are, of course, CIA agents and Special Forces troops operating inside Syria, but this is the first public announcement of it. So again, let's look at this. Should we look at this as the U.S. taking credit for a Syrian military victory? if you consider the fact that the Syrian military, there's only a handful of governments in the area that are fighting ISIS, and it's Iraq, Iran, and Hezbollah, as well as the Houthis, and Syria. These are the countries that are fighting ISIS, and obviously these are the countries that are under the microscope of the U.S. They have the red dot of a target on their backs. They obviously they have announced the victory, the killing of this ISIS czar before the United States did. So we got to wonder, is the U.S. taking credit for the Syrian military's victory? If they did this, it would have removed the ability of the Syrian government to take advantage of a useful morale booster. It would have provided the ability to broadcast more chest-pounding propaganda to audience back home in the West, which is what American audiences love. Some of the Chris Kyle idiots can go out and, I don't know, stand guard around every American flag or something after they see these reports. It would not be the first time that the American military took credit for another country's victory. Of course, remember when we had the Yazidis that had been trapped on top of Mount Sinjar in Iraq. It was Kurdish fighters from Iraq and Syria that fought long and hard to defeat ISIS and evacuate the trapped civilians, but the Western media was plastered with headlines praising the brave American soldiers and the wonderful Marines who were given credit for the operation. It had nothing to do with them. It was other fighters, but the U.S. military took credit for it. Well, they were out bombing other areas of Iraq because they were protecting the oil fields. They were bombing in Erbil. Now, the name of the individual killed by the Syrian military was different from the name of the man allegedly killed by the U.S. military, and you gotta, given the shadowy nature of Al-Qaeda and ISIS forces that are backed by the U.S., it's reasonable to question whether or not Saif ever actually existed, or whether he was actually killed if he did exist. So those are questions as well. The U.S. obviously has no interest in defeating ISIS, at least not until the Syrian government or other non-compliant nations have been removed from their positions. Now, we won't go into too much detail because we're going to try to get to some other things in the show, but it's clear that the U.S. is supporting ISIS. They have been. They created ISIS. The U.S. bombing helps ISIS. So there's no interest in defeating ISIS. In other words, so bear that in mind. Now, let's stay on Syria for a minute. I want to mention one other thing. We've got numerous attempts at portraying Assad as guilty of committing atrocities against innocent civilians. They claim that he used chemical weapons, that he's dropping barrel bombs. The media now is putting out narratives portraying the Syrian president as losing his grip on the country, and that he's making huge territorial losses, right? That ISIS is gaining ground and Assad is losing his grip. But the latest round of propaganda around this guy, Ali Mamlouk, who was the head of the Syrian Intelligence Bureau, they are claiming that he was arrested because he was engaged in a coup attempt against Assad. Now take a look at some of these headlines, right? Assad's intelligence chief Ali Mamlouk arrested for coup plot. Another one, Bashar al-Assad's spy chief arrested over Syria coup plot. And another one, Syria intel chief under house arrest for coup plot against Assad. Well, that's just pretty clear, isn't it? I mean, you can't really infer anything crazy over that. These headline titles are pretty straightforward. There's only one problem with these headlines. They're not true. Because only hours after the media frenzy began, the Syrians who were confronted with this propaganda were surprised to learn that the guy they had just seen in the presence of the President Assad at a highly prestigious meeting had been arrested as a result of a coup attempt. As is the case in most countries, the Syrians were not as gullible as American audiences and British audiences and a couple of other Western audiences here, because we should add Australians to that list, the direct visual contradiction to claims being made by media outlets generally makes it easier to determine that those claims are not true. So they could see the pictures of the guy that they were being told was under arrest, and they knew it wasn't true. So only hours after they were claiming that this guy had been arrested, a Mamluk was seen sitting next to Assad during this meeting with an Iranian official, Aladdin Boroujerdi, right? A photo of the meeting appeared on the official Sana news agency on May 13th, and the Telegraph had reported that he was arrested, but the pictures proved otherwise. Now keep in mind, this guy has been a target because the Middle East Monitor last month had reported that he was fighting for his life in Al-Shami Hospital in Damascus. A report in Middle East Eye claimed that in late April he was in a Damascus hospital after being poisoned with cyanide. He was also reported as being under house arrest one time before by the Western press, or the Western-controlled press. So in other words, just more propaganda coming out, and apparently they're trying to compete for the most outlandish propaganda narratives that can come out of Western media outlets now. All right, so we've got to talk about Macedonia as well, because I'm looking at the time here, and I hope we have time to get into all this, so I'll try my best. Now, in May of this year, we've had protests erupting in Skopje, Macedonia, against the Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski and his government. These protests are being led by Zoran Zaev, who was allegedly a target of a massive spying and surveillance scandal by the Macedonian government against Zaev, the opposition group, and other Macedonian officials and individuals as well. There was also, these protests are being painted as being a response to the cover-up of a killing of a young man by police in 2011. These protests are largely focused on the issue of government corruption. That gives you your first clue, is that the fact that this might be a color revolution. When it's vague issues like government corruption or we don't like Wall Street having too much power, that sort of thing. Tens of thousands of people out into the streets of Skopje demanding the Prime Minister's resignation, as well as the resignation of other members of his government. There was a major protest occurring on May 5th, and several anti-government protests have taken place since then. Now, some protests have been peaceful, others have been violent. In fact, more have been violent than not. On the May 5th protest alone, violent clashes between the police and protesters resulted in a number of injuries taking place on both sides. I believe they said about 40 people were injured. In the days following that, we had several Macedonian ministers resigning from their post, including the Interior Minister. But Prime Minister Gruevski has refused to resign, saying that resigning would be cowardly. On May 17th, we had thousands of protesters out into the streets again, demanding that the government resign. On the day after that, May 18th, we had thousands more on the streets in support of the government and in support of the Prime Minister. Outside of government offices in Skopje, there is an anti-Gruevski camp that has been set up indefinitely. This is remnant of the Morsi protest, the Muslim Brotherhood protest in Egypt, and of course the Occupy movement in the United States. But all you got to do really is, when you get a couple of clues as to what this is, you look at the fact that this is apparently a George Soros-funded, NATO, U.S.-funded color revolution taking place in Macedonia. So I think a few people might be confused as to why Macedonia is a target of the color revolution apparatus, especially since it's a small country, but it's the latest country that's now part of a battleground and a proxy war between Russia and the West. Both sides are competing for influence over domestic affairs and political decisions of the Macedonian government. There's also the question of geopolitical positioning and the agenda of creating micro-states and mini-states. and it's also largely related to the Balkan Stream pipeline, which is you could also call, I guess, the Turkish Stream pipeline. But let's go into this as much as we can in the time that we have remaining, and look at the fact that this is a George Soros, NATO, U.S. color revolution apparatus that is leading the charge in the unrest in Macedonia. Now, George Soros, the listeners of this show are going to know well enough what he's been responsible for. He was responsible for funding and facilitating the bulldozer revolution in Serbia that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic in 2000. He was a part of the Rose Revolution of 2003 in Georgia, part of the 2006 push to move Turkey toward a more Islamist government, actually. And he was also responsible for the Occupy movement in the United States, among many others. Now, any of these movements, you can look at the results and the fruit of the labor of these movements, and you'll see that they brought nothing but greater police states and misery and impoverishment to the people who fought on the side of the movement. The Occupy movement, I guess you could argue, is the one exception to that because it didn't bring any of that stuff. But what it did do was give activists here in the United States the opportunity to burn off excess energy and then get a few cracked skulls. But otherwise, it was an incredible waste of time. No demands, no clear strategy. It was just whining in the park, camping out in the park, and smoking pot. And that's all that they got accomplished. More anarchist garbage. So George Soros has been heavily involved in social unrest and movement-wrecking activity that took place all across the U.S. in recent months. When you look at Florida, Ferguson, Baltimore, George Soros foundations have been involved in making sure that American citizens are, A, unable to overcome racial divisions with mutual cooperation, but also that these racially isolated participants take the Black Lives Matter crap and all that. They're unable to accomplish anything of substance. They can't even accomplish anything of substance for themselves because they've been separated, isolated, and turned into basically, radically racial minority groups. So it doesn't even work for them. But it does wreck movements and divide individuals who would have been part of those movements. Now, in Macedonia, like in the United States, George Soros and his organizations work under the pretense of the left. In the United States, he's left in nature, and in Macedonia, he is also left in nature. But it's a little more powerful than that in Macedonia. Now, his most well-known NGO is the Open Society Institute, and that's highly active in Macedonia. It works with a plethora of civil society organizations. They call them civil society organizations, but what they really are tentacles of the George Soros machine. And he's so powerful in Macedonia that a lot of Macedonians have referred to Soros. They say Soros came into Macedonia like a Trojan horse, and now he is an octopus. The Open Society Institute has been active in Macedonia for some time. The head of the OSI has been Vladimir Milsin. He was head of the OSI for 20 years. Milsin was a former police informant in the days of communism, the Soviet era, and he was instrumental in ratting out a dissident actor named Risto Siskov. This guy is obviously bad news. He's a snitch for the Soviets, and now he's working with, he's been the head of the OSI. Now, the Soros networks in Macedonia are extremely powerful, and that can clearly be seen. It's almost like in Macedonia there is a very small minority of legitimate left, and the rest is George Soros. He also controls a number of large media organizations. For instance, Telma, 24 Vesti. They are, media outlets that are controlled and funded by George Soros, and these are the same media outlets that have been promoting and pushing anti-government protests. Now, even the opposition leader Zoran Zaev is a notorious Soros-funded agent. He's got close connections to the CIA. not just Zaev, but his entire Social Democratic Union of Macedonian party. This is the SDSM, which was the former Communist Party. It's been entirely taken over by the Soros machine. Remember, we've got Zoran Zaev and Radmila Sekarinska. They are said by Macedonian insiders to be nothing more than fronts for the former Prime Minister, President Branko Krevakovsky. Right? This is he continues to head up the SDSM, and he takes a large amount of money from the CIA and from various other NGOs, the National Democratic Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House, Open Society Institute, all of those groups. And it's essentially there to resist and provide a wrecking agent to Gruevski's right-of-center government with his party VMRO and DPMNE. Now, the OSI, of course, it should be mentioned, receives a large amount of money from the U.S. State Department's USAID. That is the United States Agency for International Development. Now, we've also got the tracks of Victoria Nuland all over this situation in Macedonia as well. Remember, Nuland met on the side of the 51st Munich Security Conference in Germany with the Macedonian Foreign Minister Nikola Popovski, President George Ivanov, to express, well, her problems with Gruevski's charges against her friend Zaev and his SDSM participants, his co-workers, I guess. So she offered to mediate a long-standing dispute between Greece and Macedonia over the use of the name Macedonia. Right? This is severe diplomatic problems with Greece and Macedonia over a name. And I'm sorry, I have a lot of listeners overseas, and I understand that there is a historical issue between this name issue. Right? This is the Greeks will say that Macedonia should be the former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia, I believe is the name of it, and the Macedonians will say, no, we're Macedonians. Well, I refer to them as Macedonians for one thing, so everybody can know what we're talking about, but also because it's the name of the country. And, to me, this is something that is increasingly infantile, that we would have such diplomatic rows between countries over a simple name. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is infantile, that the people at the bottom, the average Greek, the average Macedonian, has to pay the price for diplomatic rows such as these. So I would say that this is not such an issue that you should be concerned with. But moving on, the Victoria Nuland said that she was going to negotiate between the Greeks and the Macedonians to try to get this thing worked out. But what this really was, Nuland was really trying to kind of enable the increased grip on the Macedonian government, with of course with the Zionist and global banking cartels that come with it, to seize power in Skopje. She was basically trying to get in and create Kiev, Ukraine version 2.0. She was actually involved in a coup attempt, and these individuals who were involved in the coup attempt with her were subject to police raids. They'd found laptops, desktops, mobile phones, CDs, DVDs, hard disks, all that stuff of information pointing to the coup. In fact, she was actually charged by Macedonian intelligence agencies with trying to be part of a coup there in Macedonia. Now, that shouldn't really come as a surprise to anybody, but the Macedonian press and the Russian press is now pointing out that George Soros has tapped into the Canvas network in Macedonia. So they're reporting that Canvas members have gotten themselves permanently banned from entering Russia. That's good for Russia. They made the right decision. But unfortunately, they're all over in the Macedonian capital and the country there. The OSI and the CIA, as well as all the hangers-on, all the other tentacle organizations, have hired Canvas to do work there in Macedonia. Canvas issued a memo to Macedonian students, this is 3 weeks before the protest, and said that they would give them an award, a $1,500 award, to the 2 best protest ideas. And the ideas were sent to Sonia Ismail, that's the daughter of Gunnar Ismail, is a popular SDSM member and official. The Canvas organization also is apparently helping to organize and perfect ideas of how to get these protests and demonstrations going for maximum effect. The group has been heavily involved in a number of different color revolutions. In fact, you can refer to them, Tony Carlucci has referred to them as the CIA coup college. Remember, the Canvas stands for Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies, and they were involved in the April 6 youth movement in Egypt. Remember, they were involved in setting up color revolution strategies there. They were involved with Serbia's Otpor as well. Eastern Europe, they're very heavily involved in. They work with their partners, they call them partners, but it's the Albert Einstein Institution, Freedom House, International Republican Institute, and a couple of others, all color revolution organizations as well. Remember, Canvas was also involved in assisting the Rose Revolution of Georgia, the Orange Revolution of Ukraine. They work with networks in Myanmar or Burma, and Belarus. Of course, Belarus has been clamping down on them pretty hard. But it doesn't look like we're going to get to go through all of this stuff, but the question of the wiretapping issue, it's open for debate. We don't know who wiretapped to. Of course, the Western press is reporting the news as if the Macedonian government has wiretapped 20,000 people who are individual citizens, members of the opposition, and government officials. But there's a lot of good evidence to show that this is not the case, and that it was actually the opposition working with the CIA and the Color Revolution organizations that were wiretapping the Macedonian government so that they could use edited tapes as blackmail against the Macedonian government and try to get toehold in the government there that way, and it didn't work. But the question of the surveillance is really one it's up for grabs. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue with the question of Macedonia next week. We'll continue to explain this. I'm sorry we didn't get to go to all of it tonight, but we will pick up next week and finish the topic and cover anything that may have developed since then. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
For more news, visit pigminews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard,